All right. So welcome everybody for coming on this beautiful day, actually. It feels like a rebirth into spring a little bit. And thank you to John for bringing some warm weather from Hong Kong to us here. I'm James Robson. I'm the director of the Harvard-Yenching Institute. Just wanted to welcome you all to this afternoon's HYI annual roundtable that's entitled Authoritarianism in Hong Kong. And just by a little way of background, thanks to my foresighted predecessor, Liz Perry, had made an agreement with the Association for Asian Studies to have the Harvard-Yenching Institute to support a keynote speaker at the Association of Asian Studies annual meeting, which will be taking place at the end of this week. And every year, a keynote speaker is chosen, and where they will address the association in the keynote, and that is John Burns, and I'll be introducing him shortly. And then either after that conference or before it, we convene a roundtable on the theme of the keynote speaker's address to the Association of Asian Studies. So that's a little bit of background for what we're doing here today. So I think most of us have a kind of special feeling for Hong Kong. It's a very different place. I think it hits you even before you arrive into Hong Kong. I remember when I went the first time in around 1984 or end of 83, I can't even remember right now, and flying into old Kai Tak Airport and realizing, oh my gosh, I'm below the buildings and I'm looking at a family having dinner there. And so from that moment, I knew this is going to be something very interesting. And it became a very special place. Many of us using it as an entry point into Hong Kong, but also it became a place for coming out of Hong Kong and relaxing, having some good food. I fondly recall sitting by Star Ferry and just relaxing in the sun there, and going out to places like Lama Island or Lantau Island before it became the site of the new airport. There were far too many expensive electronics stores where I couldn't afford to buy anything, but this was a thriving place, a very interesting place to be. So one thinks back, I think as one gets a little bit older and you start to realize that you've actually lived through a period of history that one can reflect back on, and you realize that throughout that over 30-year period, that these little events or little things that have happened along the way start to add up to something that is actually somewhat historical, and only can see them, at least for myself, see them in retrospect. And I think that's certainly the case for me in terms of Hong Kong, a kind of slow evolution and slide into the topic for today of authoritarianism in Hong Kong, almost kind of what we speak of as a kind of slow disaster in other cases where one doesn't know it, but it's constantly taking place. So just to give a little background for today, because I know the panelists will jump right into their presentations on specific topics, just to orient everyone just a little bit and remind you of a certain chronology. So in 1984, and I mean that the real year, not that one in Orwell's book, though you would be forgiven to mix them up, China pledged to preserve much of what makes Hong Kong unique when the former British colony was to be handed over in 1997. So it was stipulated that Hong Kong would be able to maintain a separate legal system under a framework known as One Country, Two Systems until the year 2047. According to the basic law, quote, no department of the Central People's Government and no province, autonomous region, or municipality directly under the central government may interfere in the affairs which the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region administers on its own, end of quote. So we realize now that we are now more than halfway through that transition period, and it's clear that Beijing has taken increasingly brazen steps to encroach on Hong Kong's political systems and crack down on dissent. I think thinking through that chronology, one can remember back, and one could actually start much earlier, but let's just take 1989 first, then 2002, 2004 protests, 2012 when you had the anti-national education movement, and then of course 2014, the Occupy Central or the Umbrella movement, 2015 when the publishers were arrested, 2016, and then of course the massive protests in 2019 that were kicked off with the anti-extradition law that was protested against, and then of course in 2020 as well when Beijing imposed a sweeping national security law in Hong Kong. And since then, authorities have arrested dozens of pro-democracy activists, lawmakers, journalists, and also limited the voting rights of the citizens, and also limited the freedom of the press and speech as well. In March of 2024, Hong Kong lawmakers passed Article 23 and additional security legislation that further cements China's rule on the city's rights and freedoms. So now all Hong Kong officials are required to more or less pledge allegiance to China, and residents of Hong Kong are encouraged to report on one another and self-censor. So these are some of the issues that come up. So we have with us today then first we have a lot of important topics that will be touched on today that extend from governance to economics, law, civil society or civil liberties, changes in the electoral system, also freedom of press, who could forget the 5 publishers, but also the Jimmy Lai case, and also impacts on higher education. And one of our former colleagues here was implicated in that, Rowena He, who was removed from the position at Chinese University of Hong Kong. So fortunately, we have a distinguished and very experienced set of panelists today, and to discuss these key issues and bring their perspectives on it. So let me begin first by I'm going to introduce all the speakers so that we can then have them come up. And I should also point out before I do this that 2 important things. We are videoing today's panel and the Q&A, so please don't take any bootleg videos and that kind of thing, but also just to let you know that during the Q&A, and then if any reason the panelists would not like to post it, we'll make that decision later, but for now it's being recorded. Also, there will be a reception following the panel discussion today. If you go out the doors, keep going to the left into the Ted and Doris Lee gathering room, which is just to the left. Okay, so now for the main event. It really gives me great pleasure to introduce John P. Burns, who is Emeritus Professor and Honorary Professor of Politics and Public Administration of the University of Hong Kong, where he taught for 40 years. He served as Chair Professor of Politics and Public Administration from 1996 to 2017, Dean of the Faculty of Social Sciences from 2011 to 2017, and he obtained his undergraduate degree from St. Olaf College and then the University of Oxford, and a PhD in Political Science from Columbia University. He specializes in the politics of China, focusing on political selection and civil service management and reform. And he has consulted for the Asia Development Bank, the OECD, and the United Nations Development Program and the World Bank, where his work focused on governance and administrative reform in China. He's the author or editor of 8 books, and including Government Capacity in the Hong Kong Civil Service and Political Participation in Rural China. His academic articles have appeared in a number of very important scholarly journals, such as the China Quarterly, Journal of Contemporary China, Pacific Affairs, and Public Administration and Development. And he's also been active in writing op-ed pieces that have appeared in the Diplomat, Global Asia, Mingbao, and the Hong Kong Free Press, where he has his own page. And he's also appeared on television broadcasts from Al Jazeera to the BBC, Bloomsburg, CNN, and Sky News. He's widely quoted in the media, such as the New York Times, CNN, The Guardian, LA Times, Nikkei Asia, and local media in Hong Kong. So thank you so much for joining us, John, and before the Association for Asian Studies meeting. Then, as part of our panel, the first speaker will be Michael C. Davis, who is the professor of law and international affairs at Jindal Global University in India and a senior research scholar at the Weatherhead East Asia Institute at Columbia University. He's widely sought after as a scholar on human rights in Asia and also holds non-residential fellowships at the Liu Institute of Asian Studies at the University of Notre Dame and the Center for Comparative Public Law at the University of Hong Kong. He was previously the Regan Fassel Democracy Fellow at the National Endowment for Democracy and the Shell Senior Human Rights Fellow at Yale Law School. A professor of law at the University of Hong Kong until late 2016, he's also held distinguished visiting professorships at Northwestern University, Notre Dame, Case Western Reserve, and his books include Constitutional Confrontation in Hong Kong, Human Rights and Chinese Values, and International Intervention in the Post-Cold War. He's also contributed many commentaries and analysis to newspapers like the Washington Post, New York Times, South China Morning Post, and the latter for which Amnesty International and the Hong Kong FCC awarded him a 2014 Human Rights Press Award for commentary. So thank you for joining us, Michael. And next to him is Victoria Tin-bor, who is an associate professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Notre Dame. And she went from being a first-generation college student studying journalism at the Chinese University of Hong Kong through an academic, and then through an academic exchange program, went to Georgetown University to earn her PhD in political science, and to earning her PhD in political science at Columbia University before ultimately joining Notre Dame as a faculty. Professor Hui's first research paradigm examined the impact of violence on the historical evolution of China, where she published a book entitled War and State Formation in Ancient China and Early Modern Europe, and which challenges conventional Chinese wisdom by arguing that the unification of the warring states was not a natural progression, but a result of domination strategies. And she's also published various articles and chapters on Chinese politics and international relations, including Getting Asia Right, De-Essentializing China's Hegemony in Historical Asia. But beyond her historical research, Professor Hui analyzes the dynamics of resistance and repression in global struggles for freedom, particularly in Hong Kong. And between college and graduate school, she worked in the city's pro-democracy movement. And since the Umbrella Movement in 2014, she's become a scholar activist, writing extensively on protest and repression, testifying before Congress, and providing commentary in international media. Her writings include Crackdown, Hong Kong Faces Tiananmen 2.0, and also The Bad Birth and Premature Death of One Country, Two Systems in Hong Kong. Her contributions extend beyond academia, and she co-founded the Hong Kong Democracy Council to advocate for Hong Kongers in the United States and served as a fellow with the Congressional Executive Commission on China, supported by the Council of Foreign Relations in 2021 and 2022. Next to her is Rana Mitter, who is the S.T. Lee Chair in the U.S.-Asia Relations at Harvard Kennedy School. He's the author of several books, including Forgotten Ally, China's World War II, which won the 2014 RUSI Duke of Westminster's Medal for Military Literature and was named a Book of the Year in the Financial Times and The Economist. His latest book is China's Good War, How World War II is shaping a new nationalism. And his writing on contemporary China has appeared recently in Foreign Affairs, the Harvard Business Review, The Spectator, The Critic, and The Guardian. And he has commented regularly on China in media and forums around the world, including the World Economic Forum at Davos. And his recent documentary on contemporary Chinese politics, entitled Meanwhile in Beijing, is available on BBC Sounds. He's the co-author with Sophia Gaston of the report Conceptualizing a UK-China Engagement Strategy, and he won the 2020 Medlicott Medal for Service to History awarded by the UK Historical Association and came to Harvard after teaching at Oxford and as a fellow of the British Academy. And then finally, on the end, is Kellee Tsai, who has become the new dean at Northwestern University's College of Social Sciences Humanities, which she assumed that position just over a year ago, February 26 of 2024. And her career spans leadership roles in higher education, most recently as dean of the School of Humanities and Social Sciences and a chair professor of social science at Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. At Hong Kong University of Science and Technology, Dean Tsai served as an associate director of the Center for AI Research and a founding director of the center's AI Ethics and Governance Lab, where she brought the social sciences and humanities into conversation on ethical uses for AI. Previously, she spent 13 years at Johns Hopkins University as a professor of political science, vice dean of the humanities and social sciences, and director of the East Asian Studies program. She's also an international board member of the Asia Research Institute at the National University of Singapore and the India-China Institute at the New School for Social Research in New York City. Dean Tsai's research focuses on the political economy of China with an emphasis on party-state capitalism and the surveillance industry and the local development impact of reverse migration in China and India. She holds a BA in political sciences from Barnard College and a Master's of International Affairs from Columbia University's School of International Public Affairs and a PhD in political science from Columbia University. So that is the entire panel, and now I would like you to join me in welcoming Professor John Burns to deliver the first talk today. Thank you very much, John.
My goodness, what a shock it is to be here. Thank you, James, and thank you, Liz. I mean, without Liz and the many other people here at the Harvard-Yenching Institute, this just wouldn't happen. And thank you, my fellow panelists, for agreeing to come to talk, help us to understand this, I think, very important topic. I want to declare my position at the very beginning, at the risk of, offending you, and that is that one country, two systems, which is the constitutional order of Hong Kong, is not dead. This is my position. It is damaged, yes, but my argument is that it is not dead. So this topic, authoritarianism in Hong Kong, how should we approach it? What is authoritarianism? Usually, we look at it as the absence of something, the absence of free and fair elections, the absence of something, but we don't say, what is it? And so the approach I prefer to take is to look at it as, look at it in terms of authoritarian practices. So what are these authoritarian practices? From one perspective, the perspective that I'm going to adopt here, they focus on sabotaging or disabling accountability. My argument is that since 2020, this is precisely what has gone on in Hong Kong. And so our system of accountability, we had a system of accountability, and the people of Hong Kong knew this. 2.7 million people in Hong Kong have been born since 1991, when we had the first elections to our legislature. 2.7 million, and even more. This is all they have known. They have known the late colonial, more liberal civil society, which gave us relative freedom of speech, relative freedom of the press, relative freedom to demonstrate and to protest. All of these things we have lost these to some degree since 2020, it appears to me. And this is as the authorities' disabled voice. I'm a pan-democratic voter. I have no place to go in the new setup, which values official patriots. So patriotism in Hong Kong has become a kind of bureaucratic thing. It's not what I feel for the country. It's what officials feel about me. You know, and this has narrowed the space the civil society for civil society and civil liberties in Hong Kong. I am the first to admit that that is what's gone on. So if we consider the late colonial period, why did the British do this? James went through a kind of chronology. Why did the British do this? I mean, I think it was part of legacy building. They even considered whether the governor should be elected, the last governor, which they then decided, no, that's not a good idea. But we did have elections with consequences. This is the most important thing that we have lost. We had elections with consequences. And what were these consequences? We had elections where we could vote for where there was real competition, let's say that. There isn't now. There's curated competition, I would say. Mm-hmm. We had elections where citizens nominated the candidates. Now we have elections where the party nominates candidates. We had elections where there was, producing a legislature that could vote against the budget. It's in the basic law. Can they vote against the budget? Well, they can't vote against the budget for no reason. They can't pledge to vote against the budget for no reason. I mean, if they pledge to do that, they could be guilty of trying to overthrow the state. So we've come a long way, I would say, from the colonial era and from the early period, especially 2002 to 2020. During that period, we had SARS, the COVID precursor. SARS 1, we had SARS, and the government had the capacity, the legislature had the capacity to investigate this and to hold the government to account. My argument is we've lost that. We no longer have that. And sanctioning our officials is an absolutely core part of accountability. If you don't have the capacity to sanction, you don't have accountability. And this, I think, we have lost. So we did have this, and so then what happened? Was this abused? Some would argue that it was. I might even agree that it was abused. And certainly it led to a kind of ineffective governance as the people that I supported pushed ahead for a particular kind of universal suffrage. So since 2020, using the national security law, the opposition has been wiped out. The civil society support for the opposition, such as the trade unions, wiped out. And the opposition, members of the legislature and politicians and so forth, in prison, chased out of Hong Kong, or silenced. Disabling voice is one of the principal ways that authorities sabotage accountability. And this is exactly what I think has gone on since 2020. So I guess you could say, who cares? Hong Kong is this small city in East China. The leaders in Beijing have a lot of things to worry about. Why worry about Hong Kong? But Hong Kong is a place of consequence, I would put to you. It is an international financial hub and can affect economic stability. It also is a place where, trade and business regulation and international practice is established in Hong Kong. And it is a kind of bellwether for civil liberties in Asia. How well is it doing? All of these things are important. But it's also important for us in Hong Kong. And the reason it's important for us in Hong Kong is that 40 to 60% of us, including me, for decades supported the Pan-Democrats. For decades we supported them. And we are now voiceless, as I said at the beginning. And so this has consequences for trust in government, for legitimacy of government, for stability, which authoritarians crave. They want stability. So why am I, and here I'll end here, why am I saying that, one country's two systems is not dead? After all that, you would say, what is there to talk about? But if you compare the autonomy of Hong Kong to the autonomy of mainland cities, for example, you would find that Hong Kong has more autonomy in several critical areas. One of them is in the legal area. Now, maybe, Michael and I will disagree about this, and I'm not a lawyer, so you may not want to consider what I have to say very seriously, but I would say I've watched many court cases, many national security trials. I've been there. I've seen the judges and the lawyers, using the common law, trying to integrate the common law with mainland law. So this is one area. Another area is in religion. Hong Kong is not part of the patriotic church. Another area is in education, and even the university where I work. Another one is the internet, and in the media. Even though Apple Daily was shut down, Stand News, Citizen News, these have all been shut down, there's still independent reporting going on. It's independent enough for the police to keep slamming Ming Bao, if you've been following this. And Ming Bao, so far, has taken it. It's fired its cartoonist, that's true, and it took various steps, that's true. And the other thing I would appeal to you, if you have any influence at all, I come to Harvard, I think I'm speaking to very influential people, right? So if you have any influence at all, don't sanction Hong Kong politicians and judges. Especially don't sanction Hong Kong judges. And I think this is a huge mistake. Apart from the fact that sanctions don't change behavior, did Xi Jinping suddenly say, "Oh, you've sanctioned me, I'm going to go change course"? Did John Lee say that? No, none of that. So this is one reason. It does have consequences, though, for foreign judges, for example, who might serve on our Court of Final Appeal, and I would argue we need these judges. And so it could dissuade them from doing that. So without giving a full-bodied argument about either one of these things, I just state my position. That's it.
Is it working? Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're all lit up. I'm not quite sure they're all on or not. I should mention just a little bit on my bio. I apparently didn't see the bio. It's about 10 years old.
Oh.
But there's a book that's out now that I even give a book talk at the Kennedy School recently called Freedom Undone, The Assault on Liberal Values and Institutions. And I mention that because I think that's relevant. It's Columbia Press, if you're interested. It's in my abstract, I think, a link to it. But I think it's important because I think at the heart of this, and I am a skeptic about John's argument whether one country, two systems is dead or not. It could be semantical to say it's not dead or it is dead, because at the end of the day, that may be what do you mean by dead and what do you mean by one country, two systems. But as his own talk presents, a lot of it, accountability is gone. And I think the accountability that we're talking about is a kind of liberal accountability. Hong Kong was and the subtitle of the book, The Assault on Liberal Values and Institutions. It was a liberal accountability. Institutions that would hold the government accountable have been degraded. And I often like to start my talks by quoting Chow Hong Tong, who says that Hong Kong is not just an anomaly, it's a warning. So in the United States today, I kind of take this warning seriously with what's going on with assault on liberal institutions as well. And this is a problem democracies are having around the world. So in the book, I kind of pitch it as an idea that Hong Kong provides an example of the outcome of that. And that is the outcome which John described, is that people can't hold the government accountable. They don't have free and fair elections. The rule of law can be challenged. Is there some of it surviving? Not a lot. And so what I did in the book, and I started out, and I connect this mostly to China's policies. And I think China, in the case of Hong Kong and at home, it tends to intertwine two themes. One is a view that liberalism is an existential threat to China. And the other is to emphasize national security as the cure to stop this liberal threat. And I think that's at the heart of what China at home was doing. I mean, in 2012, it already issued a Document 9 that most in this room have heard of that suggests that professors and teachers should not even teach these liberal values. And then it gets more serious after Xi Jinping's power becomes more serious, where he introduces in 2014 a comprehensive national security concept. And what's interesting about it is it targets some 20 different areas of social life in China, so that almost nothing is not about national security in China, okay? And what I argue in the book is, in a way, what they've done is they've imported Xi Jinping's national security concept into Hong Kong, okay? So I think that's the danger Hong Kong has. And I can say this because the second interference where Hong Kong passed its own national security law, there was a white paper. And the Hong Kong government went on at great length in this opening two chapters of the white paper, praising the mainland, a whole society approach to national security, okay? And this approach, they even identified these 20 different areas of society. So what I would say is China, when it comes to national security and why this connects to liberalism, is China, in a way, the officials in Beijing view the Chinese people as the biggest threat to national security. That if they have these ideas on board and try to move forward on them, whether it's judicial review or other liberal accountabilities, a free press, that the Communist Party will be overthrown. And so what I think happened is they introduced that to Hong Kong. And I think in doing so, they kind of, they in a sense, overturned the constitutional order in Hong Kong. If you look at the Sino-British Joint Declaration and the Basic Law, it was a bit short on democracy, but pretty strong on these accountability institutions, on the rule of law and all of that. And these are, in effect, Hong Kong was a liberal place. So is that the heart of one country, two systems? I would say it is. Now, some people would say, well, China couldn't have intended that, the Communist Party and so on. Well, they didn't intend it. They shouldn't have written it into the Sino-British Treaty and the Basic Law. They clearly did. And so there's all these elements, and I don't have time in 10 minutes to go through them, but the book goes through them at great length. And it also engages with the people of Hong Kong. I would argue over the years, Hong Kong democracy protests have been as much about these liberal institutions as they've been about democracy. And why? Because they felt that the Hong Kong government really didn't have genuine autonomy, that Beijing was increasingly influential in Hong Kong. And so the only answer to all of that is to, in effect, institute democracy so that there's a government that would serve the people and not just answer to Beijing, okay? Why do you want that? Well, when I first came to Hong Kong in 1985, it was interesting to people. I asked my class, what would you like the future of Hong Kong to be? And they says, oh, well, return Hong Kong to China and then hire the British to run it, okay? So this was not an intensely protest-oriented society at that stage. Why do they become that way? They become that way because one of the characteristics that society had is that almost half the population in one form or another had fled communist rule in China. So they knew especially what they didn't want if they wasn't sure what it would look like and how to achieve it, because there's a learning process. Even Americans don't know what their constitution guarantees. So you can't expect Hong Kong people to be above that. But at the end of the day, they knew that the answer to preserving Hong Kong's autonomy and the reason to preserve it was to preserve the rule of law. My colleagues at Chinese U, I was first at Chinese U and then Hong Kong U over 30 years. My colleagues at Chinese U, in fact, Lau Suk-ai and Guan Xinxi, Lau Suk-ai is a prominent pro-Beijing figure, and they asked Hong Kong people back in the 80s, what is the core value? And the answer was the rule of law. Mm-hmm. The Hong Kong people really valued the rule of law. So I would say a lot of the protest isn't about color revolution or something. It's about making China adhere to those commitments in the Sino-British Joint Declaration and the Basic Law. And I argue in the book that what really happened is the Hong Kong government, with Beijing's support, overthrew that liberal order. So they overthrew the Constitution. And then we have this kind of strange situation where the people that overthrew the constitutional order are prosecuting the people who were defending it, who were trying to preserve the liberal order in Hong Kong, and the promises made. Do they become skeptical? Of course they do. Over time, there's more and more erosion. Again, the book goes through all of this, the protests, why they're protesting, essentially everything from the handover to the present. But they more and more recognize that their rule of law, this open society guarantees they wanted, was at risk. And so I would argue, and I do argue in the book, that was what was going on. Now, you get this national security law imposed on them. It has all these kinds of things like Chinese government doesn't trust judges. They don't want the judicial review, as Hong Kong had it and US has it, right? They don't want that. So they say only designated judges can hear national security cases. So how can we have confidence if, and they provide in this national security law that if a designated judge says anything that threatens national security in any way, that he could be dismissed from the designated judges. So there's a threat to them. And so you can understand why people watching the outcome of these national security cases are skeptical that the courts are just adhering and carrying out their role as common law courts. They're just not, okay? So that's the problem. And so now the free press, one of the things in Hong Kong I was always stunned about was the press was more liberal than in this country. It was, there was a communist press, there was the middle ground press, there's the Apple Daily over on the other side, and it was so vigorous. And that, again, is a kind of liberal thing that's under threat for Beijing. It threatens Beijing, and so they want to silence it. And even the tactics used is to arrest a few. They say, we don't have to arrest very many people. Somehow they got the memo from Beijing that if you arrest a few people, that the rest will go silent because they don't know whether they can speak. They don't know what the red lines are, as Hong Kong people were fond of saying. And even us overseas. I mean, I've written this book, testified in Congress. I'm now actually at the Wilson Center, not in India anymore.
Oh, okay.
but I don't know if I could go back to Hong Kong and get in. I'm not going to chance it because I don't know if I get in, if that's a good thing, whether I can get out. But this is a problem. I mean, I was a member of the Article 23 concern group back in the days. So I was very much, like John, supportive of and very much involved with the democracy movement. It wasn't a violent movement. It was a movement trying to give substance to the guarantees that were made. So that was done in the national security law. They even violate what was read by our colleague here at the beginning, that mainland departments should not interfere in Hong Kong affairs. Well, now they set up mainland departments, an office for safeguarding national security in Hong Kong. And they set up a committee for our safeguarding national security that's directly under the Central People's Government, okay? And it has an advisor, in quotes, okay, a supervisor. So that's kind of what's happening. So you can see why people who tried to stand up for democracy, that 40, 50, I'd say 55%, that they are skeptical about whether they can speak. And of course, they want to not be in jail. So it's a sad point when I'm interviewed often is all my friends are in jail or in exile. So this is not that's not one country, two systems promise that was made. Is Hong Kong becoming another mainland city? I would say no. It's becoming more like Xinjiang or Tibet, because it is a place like there that has a resistance, that people who are really not just neutral on things, but they are standing up and they have stood up against them. So that's, of course, we know true of the Tibetans, it's true of the Uyghurs. So in a way, it's hard to say it's just becoming another mainland city. I fear there's something much worse going on. And so I've really done what I can do in 10 minutes, and I'll pass it on to Victoria.
Great.
Thank you.
That's mine.
That was yours.
I'll switch to. Great, thank you so much. Here we go. I'm just going to use one graph. And so I'll make sure that I can speak in about 10 minutes. You guys want to sit over there so that you can actually see the graph?
Yeah.
We can see it.
Okay, all right.
Yeah, we're good.
I know this graph.
Okay, so I think I remember. So when I talk to people who still live in Hong Kong, I think a lot of them all agree with John that Hong Kong is not dead. But at the same time, we can see that one country, all of these indexes plunge, and they are not at zero. If that means that you cannot breathe anymore, they are not at zero, but they are very close to zero. And this graph I just generated very quickly from VDEM. My colleague Michael Coppage designed this, and so I'm just using the data. I use it a lot. And I want to emphasize that one country, two systems, essentially, it was meant to be unique. And then this is another way that Tilly and Taro would call a hybrid regime. And hybrid regime is not something between the more democratic and more authoritarian, something in the middle. It is not. It is that you have actually the same country where some people live in a system with more liberties and freedom where other people don't. And Tilly and Taro argue that this kind of hybrid structure is inherently untenable. In all these other cases around the world, they either the part that enjoys more liberties and freedom become reined in by the more authoritarian side, or the entire system becomes more democratic. And we know which way Hong Kong has gone. And then if we see only the civil. If we look at the liberal democracy index, you can see that it's actually pretty flat. It didn't really change. And so in a way that is, Hong Kong's authoritarianism. Hong Kong's only known more or less authoritarianism with very little democracy. And the little bump happened because in 1991, as John already mentioned, the first ever direct elections to the Legislative Council. And only 18 seats out of 60 were open for a direct competition. And the Democratic candidates won 16 of those 18 seats. And it was that time that then I wrote to the Democratic Party of Hong Kong at the time and said that maybe, do you guys need to hire someone? And I became their press officer. I think among the people here, I'm the only one who was born in Hong Kong, grew up in Hong Kong, watched everything unfold in front of my eyes, and then a lot of hope, and then a lot of despair. And then, but if we just look at this, that is one thing. But Hong Kong's one country, two systems model, the difference is that it was also the world's only model with freedom but without democracy, with civil society without democracy. We look at all of these other indicators, the rule of law, academic freedom, civil liberties index, liberal components indexes, basically anything that we associate as, elements of liberalism, they're always very high. So this was the system that we saw, but then recently they all plunge. What is also interesting to see is that as we look at the graphs, if increases actually went up again around the time of 1991, but the collapse, the plunges happened a lot earlier than 2019, a lot earlier than 2020. And in a way, we think back, the Hong Kong people for a long time was talking about mainlandization of Hong Kong system becoming eroded. Hong Kong people were also talking about we are like frogs who would, if you put frogs in a pot of warm water and then you turn up the heat just a little, the stupid frog doesn't know. But if you turn up the fire, the frog will jump out and cannot get killed. So a lot of these analogies really explain that a lot of those liberties were already coming down. And in a way that a lot of things happen also around the time in this, basically for the most of the 2010s. But it is also interesting that since Kellee is going to talk about academic freedom began to plunge ahead of most other indicators. And the rule of law began to plunge the last. And now it is also really coming down very close to zero. And then I also want to, the second point I want to really make is that what explained this? So there are two things, why we see it the way it is today. Another thing is why, there was a little bit of bump earlier. John earlier mentioned that, why did the British introduce some kind of democracy? Is it about the guild? Is it about the legacy? Now, I was in Hong Kong in 1984. I was still in high school and we were put in a classroom and we were all watching this television. Even in the whole stadium, the television would be like this size in the corner of the wall. And we all watched the signing of the Sino-British Joint Declaration. We didn't know what to make of it. But then immediately, we participated in a lot of these discussions. Wow, we were not involved, we were not invited, we didn't have a seat at the table. Beijing wouldn't allow that. But the Sino-British Joint Declaration also says that it's going to be Hong Kong people ruling Hong Kong. So I'm 18, and then, maybe I'll get to actually have a say. And a lot of my classmates, when we got to university, we got together, we formed these discussion clubs, we went to rallies, we did everything, to get our voices heard. And it was actually our demand that there should be direct elections in 1988. And that was killed by the UK government under the pressure of the Beijing government. And so it didn't really happen until 1991. And then only 18 seats out of 60 seats were open for geographical constituencies, direct elections. And so another thing this is also important is why, a lot of things actually were going flat until more recently, until the past decade or so. I want to highlight the importance, the centrality of Tiananmen as the original scene of what has happened. Mike Davis earlier said that liberalism is like existential threat for Beijing. Tiananmen, the real concrete, liberalism could be like, how do we define it? What does it feel like? What does it touch like? Tiananmen is something everyone can feel, everyone can touch, everyone knows what it means. In May and June 1989, Hong Kong people had this slogan, today's Hong Kong, today's Tiananmen, tomorrow's Hong Kong, the other way. And why? If they could kill their own people today, they would just kill us all after the handover. And so for Hong Kong people, the call for direct election for democracy was already really brewing before Tiananmen, the call for direct elections in 1988. After Tiananmen, it became so much more important. Now, there were two things people wanted. One, to get citizenship with the United Kingdom. Margaret Thatcher sold us out. Two, then we needed to have democracy in Hong Kong because at the time, people who watched the 1.5 million people who poured to the street in Hong Kong to support all the movements in China already understood that Hong Kong can enjoy freedom without democracy, can enjoy civil liberties without democracy, can enjoy all the things, good things without democracy. Only because the Hong Kong government could have accountability because it was ultimately accountable to the UK government in London. Without that, then everything is dictated by Beijing. There's basically no more accountability. And everyone wanted to have democracy. The thing is that, Mike Davis said that, did Beijing really mean all those promises? I think that maybe they did in 1984 when they signed the Sino-British Joint Declaration. But think about it is that at the time, they made promises to Hong Kong people. You guys can go horse racing as usual. You can go dancing as usual. Huh? Telling someone who was like 18, 17, 18, we don't care about horse racing or dancing. You are treating us as these decadent capitalists who don't know anything. The only thing we care about is making more money. This was how Beijing leaders view Hong Kong people. You guys don't care about the freedom and democracy. You only care about, enriching your own pockets. That was the idea. So when 1.5 million people poured to the street, oh my God, they actually care more about freedom and democracy and not just about horse racing and dancing as usual. That was when everything turned wrong. On the one hand, Hong Kong people wanted democracy in order to preserve freedom. Beijing was like, we absolutely cannot allow democracy. And so we are seeing this gap between democracy and freedom playing out over time. For 2 decades, Beijing denied Hong Kong democracy. Baby step, and then stop, and stop, and stop. And then at the same time, Hong Kong people had the freedom to keep marching on the street on January 1st, June 4th, July 1st, October 1st. And those protests got bigger and bigger as the crackdown got more and more severe. And Beijing didn't like that. Hong Kong people enjoyed the freedom to demand democracy that they had absolutely no determination, no willingness to give. And therefore, ultimately, we see the killing of freedom along with the absence of delivery of promises of democracy. And so this goes back to really Till Terror's arguments that this hybrid system is not sustainable. It is just going to get killed. And also want to emphasize that in Chinese politics, there's also a concept. So Mike said that what Hong Kong people wanted was not color revolutions because essentially the way that a lot of officials would equate the Hong Kong protests with color revolutions, which to them means regime change, which also means that because a lot of the color revolutions around the world emphasize nonviolence, therefore, essentially, the focus on nonviolence was really not meant to have any chance of succeeding. Students launched boycotts and consumer boycotts, class boycotts, and also that people went on strike. Every one of those attempts that had proven to be really useful in cases like South Africa would turn out to be, would basically had no chance of succeeding in Hong Kong. But also that what happened is that when people demand that they get what's been promised to them in black and white, there's a better term. O'Brien tells us that it is called rightful resistance. So it is very difficult these days to continue with this rightful resistance, but we're very close to zero. So in the next few years, I don't know if it's really going to zero or it's going to stay at this level or we're going to go back up. So too early to tell. Thank you.
Thank you. Rana?
Yeah. So, unlike my distinguished fellow panelists, I think I'm the only one here who hasn't lived in Hong Kong on at least, a significantly permanent or semi-permanent basis, and so I have to kind of confess that up front. But like many of all of my fellow panelists, and I think like the rest of you or most of you here, I've been visiting Hong Kong and have had ideas about Hong Kong for a very long time. In fact, I think I remember seeing the first film I ever saw set in Hong Kong just a short time before I visited it for the first time in the late 1980s. The film was set, if I remember correctly, in a girls' reformatory school, don't judge me. And it contained the line, if I remember correctly, where one character says to another, "Don't flush the cocaine down the toilet, we need the money to pay the loan shark." I have to say that arriving in Hong Kong in real life was, let's say my expectations were raised by seeing that film, and what I found there was not perhaps quite a literal rendering of what happened in that film, or at least not so far. But I will exchange that for, I think, the most important and extraordinary phenomenon which Hong Kong was for a very long time, and which I think Victoria alluded to in her comments, which is that it was, in political science terms, and we are, of course, in a university, so I think we should pay a certain amount of tribute to political science, an anomaly, a genuinely liberal polity that was not, in a meaningful sense, democratic. And the number of entities that fit into that particular part of the Venn diagram is very, very small indeed. If Hong Kong is not unique, it's certainly very rare indeed. The other way round, systems which have electoral multi-party democracy, but which are rapidly losing their civil liberties, are sadly commoner and commoner on pretty much every continent around the world today. So the Hong Kong reversal of that particular settlement was something both to be examined and I think celebrated. And it is certainly the case that the Hong Kong that existed at that time is not the Hong Kong of today. But in analysing it, I want to add in the minutes that I have an addition. I cannot match the brilliant graph that Victoria has shown us, again, coming from the use of VDEM and other major indexes, nor can I match the experience of either John or Michael in their analysis. But I can add perhaps a bit of history, since as someone growing up in Britain in the 1970s and 1980s, Hong Kong was never really at the forefront, but it was certainly present and talked about in terms of the British national conversation. And I think in some ways, understanding what was changing in Britain and China during that period is key to understanding why Hong Kong had this period of liberal anomaly, and perhaps also why it has come to an end, at least for now. So I want to add a note of positivity into the analysis as well, where there is a certain amount of necessary bleakness. The period that is in your graph, actually, Victoria, from the 1970s up to the late 2010s, marks something like a half century in which the outgoing British administration and the incoming Chinese one shared by default an agreement to reshape Hong Kong according to that globally anomalous template, that the territory should be meaningfully free, not just economically, but also in terms of civil liberties, but not fully democratic, or at least at the beginning of that period, really not democratic at all. And it's worth going back to the 1970s, when many of the phenomena that see the kind of rising of that spike in the middle of the graph, the early 1970s, became evident, notably under the governorship of Murray MacLehose, who many in Hong Kong who remember that back that far even today would regard, I think, as a fairly transformational British governor during that period, from 1971 to 82. It is notable that that period under MacLehose saw the developments that would shape much of the city as we see it, at least physically today, including the first building of the MTR transit system. I was informed by a Singaporean friend that the reason they call their metro the MRT and not the MTR is just that they want to show Hong Kong that they're different, but I think the Hong Kong one came first. And the establishment, of course, of large areas of natural parkland, which still remain a very important part of what makes Hong Kong's wider countryside so distinctive, and again, should be attributed to actions taken actively by the British administration of the time. Parkland and metro railways are all very well, but we have to acknowledge that MacLehose famously did not increase the democratic mandate in Hong Kong. Again, the allusion to those events are very clear in what my fellow panelists have said. However, the tentative moves that came under his successor, Edward Youde, did go a certain way towards that limited version of democratization, which could be seen emerging in the 80s and 90s, and which was, of course, heavily criticized by Beijing, with an accusation that Britain was democratizing only at that point when it was halfway out the door. Particular aficionados of Hong Kong history, I see some in the audience here today, might remember that I think way back in 1947, Mark Young, once he had been released from the Japanese prisoner of war camp, where he'd been held during World War II, did tentatively put forward some plans for democratization, but a combination of the spillover of the Chinese Civil War and a reluctance in the British Attlee government, which was already engaged in giving independence to India, didn't want necessarily more troubles on its doorstep at that time. But that decade, 1971 to 82, the MacLehose years, I think did start the development of wider changes, or taking advantage of wider changes that were not obviously democratic at the time, but helped shape the atmosphere that I think everyone here who has been in Hong Kong during that period will have known and appreciated. I think the liberal anomaly was not accidental. First of all, of course, the 1970s was the period of the global financial system being reworked to its, at its fundamental level. The Nixon shocks of the early 1970s, the ending of the old Bretton Woods system, and the liberalization of currencies under Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher, and others. Margaret Thatcher, of course, very relevant to Hong Kong, and markets being transformed by new technology. And Hong Kong very much took advantage during that time. It was also an era when data, in the sense that we understand it today, the digitalization even of data became freer, but could only be used to full effect in a city or a community which was better educated and more free and more international. Both expats and Hong Kongers in the city became overall richer, but by necessity, they also became freer in thought as universities and the press thrived in an environment which that global, data-rich, financially oriented environment needed. This was not a coincidence. And I'm speaking to one of the great experts in Chinese banking next to me, so Kellee can probably tell me where I've got this wrong later on. In some ways, we should not forget, this echoed what was happening until your moment of transition, 1989, the Tiananmen Square killings. Before 1989, in mainland China, there seemed to be many signs that Deng Xiaoping's China was liberating in the public sphere without necessarily adding democratic mechanisms. In other words, the party then, as now, showed no signs of becoming a multi-party system. But the public sphere that was open in the 1980s in China, despite the arrest of figures like Wei Jingsheng and others, was actually remarkably open, certainly compared to what happened after 1989. If you don't believe me, go back and read mid-1980s editions of Du Shu magazine, amongst other examples of wide-ranging intellectual thinking. Mm-hmm. In other words, we have a 50-year period, let's say, that spanned the handover, not quite equally, but almost, which is a remarkable case of a last major colony run by a democracy and then by an authoritarian party state with some willingness to allow an autonomous public sphere to create a level of continuity in governance. And that was true particularly amongst the last governors, David Wilson and Chris Patten, both of whom pushed in this direction, and Chris Patten in particular, obviously very central to the 1995 electoral reforms, which widened the franchise really to the widest it's ever been in Hong Kong, because it was then switched back in certain ways in 97. And then, to be fair, under the first succession of chief executives of Hong Kong after 1997, who did not do a great deal to change that particular environment and territory. Let me finish the thought, James, if I may, with a couple of reflections about how and why things have changed. Evidently, the national security law of 2020 has significantly, if not permanently, changed the balance. Direct political dissent against the Chinese Communist Party, which was entirely mainstream before that date, is now essentially impossible within the territory. And it also marked the end of a British-Chinese unspoken consensus that keeping Hong Kong free, if not necessarily democratic, was a key priority for the British as a token that they had not forgotten about Hong Kong, even if they, for the most part, probably had, and for China as a sign that one country, two systems had real significance. Today, I think Hong Kong is much less certain of its future, whether it's going to be a tech hub, whether it's going to be a place that actually is some kind of new financial center that essentially fuels venture capital for the mainland. Whatever that might be seems to be quite fluid in certain ways. But I think that the likelihood that without the maintenance of at least some aspects of its pre-existing freedoms, those aims will be very hard to maintain. The ending, for instance, of internet freedom, which I think, John, you mentioned, is still certainly the case in Hong Kong. The access to the international internet in the city is still recognizably, massively different from the very restrictive version that you have in the mainland. And again, speaking of the courts, there is a very small very tentative sense in some specific areas. I'm thinking of areas like LGBT plus rights, where certain recent court judgments in Hong Kong show a desire to push back, perhaps in areas that are not specifically party political, but nonetheless push in a liberal direction that is not so visible, certainly in the mainland of China, or even in some other parts of more democratic Asia. Final thought I'll give you is that of all the losses from pre-2020 Hong Kong, the one that I think is most symbolic in a sense is something I never, being a Putonghua speaker, I never really managed to get to grips with, not speaking Cantonese. And that was the long-running RTHK satire show Headliner, which was a sign of immense political health. Any society where the state broadcaster can and does encourage satire shows, ones which satire is itself all of accountability, the term that you're using there. And the decision not to have a satire show on television, even though a relatively small thing compared to the wider issue of suppression of the press and prison sentences for political dissent, is a sign of nervousness. It's a sign of lack of confidence. And that, in the end, is what Hong Kong has to maintain if the promise of one country, two systems is going to be maintained. And the other lesson, of course, that comes from Hong Kong, which I think is an object lesson for all of us across all the continents of the world. This applies in Europe, North America, South America, wherever you want to go, the rest of Asia. Building a genuinely liberal society is an extraordinarily hard thing to do. Destroying one is extraordinarily easy.
Thank you. Thanks, Rana.
So this is my slide. I'll have to click through it. I didn't know that was all animated. Okay. Well, fortunately, there are some things that the previous panelists haven't already discussed. Thanks so much for including me on this panel. A full disclosure, unlike the panelists who have published books and articles on Hong Kong and also contributed significantly to the field of Hong Kong studies, my research is really focused on the political economy of China with some comparative work involving India. I'm not a Hong Kong studies specialist. But I did spend over a decade of my life an academic/administrative career at Hong Kong University of Science and Technology, 5 years as division head of social science, and then 5 years as dean of the School of Humanities and Social Sciences. And the photo on the right was taken from my balcony. It was a lovely place to live. As John noted, Hong Kong has never been an autonomous democratic country, but for about 3 decades, it was indeed a liberal society with civil liberties like freedom of press, expression, rule of law, and there was also academic freedom in the government-funded research universities, which attracted faculty from all over the world, including myself. During my time at HKUST, things changed a lot. When I first arrived the summer of 2013, there was a massive cardboard tank built by students commemorating June 4th in the main atrium of the university. By the time I left, the democracy wall had been blank for years, except for a brief period at the end of 2022 when there were some blank A4 sheets of paper that also got taken down. And then by 2023, Hong Kong University of Science and Technology had built a new campus in Guangzhou, which was twice the size of its campus in Clearwater Bay in Hong Kong. So my remarks are going to focus on 2 main themes. First, situating shifts in academic freedom in Hong Kong relative to Taiwan and China over time, and then reflecting on developments in Hong Kong that led to the introduction of the national security law in 2020. Given that authoritarianism is a broad residual category that includes all non-democratic political regimes, I think it's important to look at finer-tuned metrics of academic freedom and trace how that's changed over time. I mean, even within democratic regimes, there's considerable variation in the extent of academic freedom, and that's certainly been the case in the US as well. Covering 170 countries dating back to 1900, the Academic Freedom Index is based on 5 metrics. There's the freedom to research and teach, meaning freedom from interference by non-academic actors such as politicians, party secretaries, businesses, foundations, religious groups, and advocacy groups. Second, academic exchange and dissemination, meaning that academics have the freedom to discuss their research findings both to academics as well as non-academic audiences. 3, institutional autonomy, meaning that the university remains in charge of governance, finance, administration, research, and teaching. Campus integrity basically refers to freedom from political surveillance, politically motivated surveillance. And then academic and cultural expression, that's from the VDEM dataset, captures academics' freedom of expression on political issues. This just shows the countries that have experienced either really significant improvements or declines in academic freedom over the past 50 years. You'll see about 56 countries above the diagonal line that have improved. These include Spain, Portugal, Taiwan, South Korea, South Africa. And then there are 10 countries below the diagonal line where academic freedom has substantially deteriorated, including in the US, UK, Netherlands, which still have high levels of academic freedom. This is just saying that it's deteriorated in the past 50 years. And then India, Bangladesh, and Hong Kong that are at the bottom at 20th percentile. The academic freedom index is measured on a scale of between 0 to 1. So 0 means no academic freedom, 1 means complete freedom. 1912 was the first year that Hong Kong was indexed. So that was the year that University of Hong Kong was established. And the level of academic freedom was relatively high at 0.71. It dipped to 0.4 during the Second World War, which is consistent with the global trend. Academic freedom dipped during the Second World War globally. Then Hong Kong's academic freedom peaked at 0.89 between 1995 and 1999. That's really flanking, just coinciding with the years just leading to the handover and right after the handover. If you look at the difference between the last 2 rows on this slide, 2013, I put that there because that's the year I arrived Hong Kong. It was right after the national education protests and on the eve of Occupy Central. And then 2023 was the year that I decided to leave HKUST and move to Northeastern University here. To put this in comparative perspective, and I apologize for all of the numbers, but I do think that it's helpful to note a few things. First, Hong Kong's current level of academic freedom at 0.24 is comparable to Taiwan's academic freedom in 1986, which was a decade before Taiwan's transition to democracy. Taiwan is now at 0.87, which was about the level of Hong Kong's level during the handover in 97. China, here we go. China's on a different scale. It reached, well, I mean, it's still on the same scale between 0 and 1, but it reached a nadir of 0.02 during the Cultural Revolution. It reached a peak of 0.2 in 1988, and that was precisely the public sphere that Rana was just discussing that had emerged during the 80s, leading up to June 4th. And now it's back down pretty far at 0.007. Now, there certainly could be methodological flaws in the academic freedom index, but they did use the same methodology, and they also used at least 2 levels of intercoder reliability. So I think if there's bias, it's at least consistent across the cases. Now, going back to Hong Kong, the introduction of the NSL in 2020 created 4 new offenses that impact academic freedom: secession, subversion, terrorism, and foreign collusion. And this was underscored by a local national security ordinance that was enacted in 2024. But a lot had already changed between 2020 and 2024. On the right here, that's from the National Security Day website. You can see what's new, what's hot. And in Hong Kong, they're leading up to April 15th, which is National Security Day. You'll see like the banners all over the place, like really reinforcing that this is an important day for Hong Kong. Fu Hualing, the dean of HKU Law, who's currently visiting at NYU Law, describes the progression of legislation and academics under attack as the, quote, increasing securitization of higher education. And this is something that my fellow panelists have referred to as well. I certainly agree with that characterization and saw steadily creeping instances of faculty who adjusted their syllabi in Chinese history and Chinese politics and Hong Kong politics and society. It was subtle and sometimes not so subtle. After the passage of the national security law in 2020, many universities saw outmigration of academics, including some who left Hong Kong without other positions lined up. But was the national security law inevitable? Michael has heard me ask this question more than once, but that question just really, really persists in my mind, having lived through that and worked through that whole period. Michael's most recent book, Freedom Undone, discusses 4 significant moments of societal mobilization in reaction to pending or proposed legislation. So they were the 2003 protests against Article 23 of the Basic Law, that the HKSAR government would enact national security legislation. 500,000 people took to the streets and the bill was withdrawn. Then, 2012, protests against a proposal for patriotic education, which mobilized youth who would go on to then participate in the umbrella movement in the fall of 2014, which had grown out of the Occupy Central protests that summer. This was after the Standing Committee of the NBC issued a white paper saying that limiting access to the nomination process of the chief executive in a way that circumscribed the principle of universal suffrage. And then the 2019 anti-extradition bill protests that escalated to a much broader swath of the population with about 2 million people on the steamy streets at its peak. I can't stop asking, to what extent were there missed opportunities for the Hong Kong government to show that it had things under control and could manage what Beijing would perceive as turmoil on the streets? The anti-extradition bill was officially proposed in April of 2019. Protests started out peacefully. They looked pretty normal. June 4th, they were out there. July 1st, they were out there. And then, in typical Hong Kong, very respectful, very peaceful, in that manner. But then it escalated after the Yunlong MTR attack by triads on July 21st. There's a widely held perception that Hong Kong's leadership did not have to stubbornly insist on persisting with an extradition bill, which was ultimately withdrawn anyway, 6 months later in October 2020. But by then, it was too late. The protests escalated into greater violence, with bows and arrows and Molotov cocktails, and a number of university campuses were paralyzed by November of 2019. I believe in human agency. I think, Hong Kong's leadership could have made different choices earlier on. To wrap up, the decline in academic freedom in Hong Kong has had implications for the demographics of its academics. Even though the outflow of foreign and expat academics probably gets a little bit more attention, it's actually more local faculty, more Hong Kong origin faculty have left the universities. The percentage of local academics was 40% in 2018 to 19. 5 years later, locals accounted for 30% of Hong Kong's local academic population. Meanwhile, the percentage of mainland origin academics, many of whom who were recruited from the US, increased by over 70% during that same period, that same 5-year period. And here you can see that the gap between the mainland origin and local faculty is the largest at HKUST, Lingnan, and City U. And only 2 out of the 8 universities in Hong Kong have more locals than mainland faculty. And that would be at EDU and Baptist. But meanwhile, the rate of faculty leaving EDU has more than doubled just in the last year, with 13% of their faculty terminating their contracts. Having said that, Hong Kong is still a more open and liberal society than the mainland. Yesterday, the UGC, the University Grants Council, which funds the 8 universities in Hong Kong, they just reported that 75% of non-local students enrolled in Hong Kong universities are from the mainland. 75%. So we should keep that reality in mind. I mean, Hong Kong definitely is not just another mainland city. It's still a bridge between the East and the West. And increasingly, it's also a bridge between mainland origin academics in the West who feel more comfortable in Hong Kong than either in the West or in the mainland. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thanks, Kellee. That was great. So thank you very much to all the panelists for putting so many intriguing propositions on the table and covering the history. I wonder if John wanted to respond at all to what the panelists have said before we open it up to the audience for questions.
Well, of course. I mean, I just want to put on the table that concepts like autonomy are relative concepts. So I heard Michael talk about genuine autonomy. So what is genuine autonomy? And so we're talking about relativities here, degrees of autonomy. And I think that's what Kellee was getting at when she was talking about academic freedom in the end. So, and then the second issue here to me is, well, what did the Leninists who were drafting the Basic Law understand by freedom of speech and all the rest that's in the Basic Law? So the same words appear in the Basic Law in Hong Kong and the Chinese Constitution. Exactly the same words, exactly the same language. And two different, I would put to you, two different understandings of what these meant. And these understandings, in my opinion, were fudged in order to ensure a smooth transition. I mean, neither the British nor the Hong Kong Chinese elite or the mainland elite investigated this in detail and pointed this out, I would say. But I think it must be clear to us that there was this difference of meaning here, what these concepts meant and what people understood by them. So there are of course other things that I could comment on, but I think I'll just leave it at that.
Great, thank you very much, John. You know, it does seem, I think, in many of the points that you all have touched on about particularly the security issues and security law. I mean, from one perspective, I think one could say that the Hong Kong kind of legal system seems to be part of a larger global trend of autocratic legalism that empowers the executive branch to use laws and courts to achieve the government's political goals, but under the pretense of the need for security, right? It becomes we're an exceptional case. So what that has seemed to have happened in Hong Kong too is that you get a complete irregular moving of the goalposts. In other words, yes, we'll have free universal suffrage in 2017, and then no, the security situation's not right. It keeps kind of moving along, and that must be incredibly frustrating to be trying to operate under that if you're trying to hold people accountable for the agreements that have been made, but it keeps shifting away from those. So yes.
One more, yes. I agree completely with Rana's point that we should see what's going on the mainland for trying to understand what's going on in Hong Kong. I mean, the securitization of everything is Xi Jinping. And so, yes, that has been brought into Hong Kong. And it's inevitable that it would be brought into Hong Kong, given where the geopolitical situation and the the way the Communist Party is perceiving security these days. I don't see how Hong Kong could have avoided that.
Yeah. One last point before we open up to questions. We tend to look at Hong Kong, how it's reacting to vis-a-vis China and that relationship. But I wonder if we could flip the vantage point and say, how is China looking at Hong Kong nowadays? So last week, Premier Li Qiang addressed the National People's Congress, and they seem to be pushing an argument about attempting to use Hong Kong for advancing development by pushing international cooperation to address primarily economic problems on the mainland and sort of seeing Hong Kong as an opportunity there. And that seems to then run into the problem of the other movements that are happening in Hong Kong about a kind of patriotic, how would you call it, ideology that's there. So how is this going to look in the future, particularly in the international investment world? But perhaps that might be a hedge against some of the changes that are happening in Hong Kong if they see it as the place that might help out the economic problems that are plaguing the mainland. But I just throw that out because of the comments that were just last week in Beijing. So, yeah. Okay, so let's, oh wow, that was a quick couple of hands. So this is the first hand I saw, and then I saw a second here, and then we'll go back there. So please, yes.
My name is Chris Anstey. I'm with Bloomberg. And I'd just like to ask about, another aspect that makes Hong Kong unique is the dollar peg. And actually, Bloomberg, some of my colleagues, reported during Trump's first term that his aides had proposed efforts to break the Hong Kong dollar peg, which the U.S. can do with U.S. Treasury regulations, essentially. I'm wondering if that question came up again and the Hong Kong dollar peg were forcibly broken by the U.S., what impact would that have on the autonomy and differentness of Hong Kong that remains today?
Any takers?
Thank you.
Good, Michael.
I think it'd be fundamental. I think it's one of the key things that makes Hong Kong sort of Hong Kong, that it has a reliable currency. And I can't imagine how reliable it will be if they break the peg. But then I'm not an economist, but my view is that it would be pretty difficult.
I think at the same time, people with money have already been hedging against that. A lot of people already have moved, they've moved their bodies outside of Hong Kong, and they have also moved their money outside of Hong Kong. And then at the same time, it's also like if there is even you don't even need the U.S. government to do anything, because even a lot of these traders, the Hong Kong's reserves have come down so low, and the budget deficit is so high that they don't even have enough bullets to defend the Hong Kong dollar if there's any effort to do that. So it's going to have important consequences.
I agree that it would be fundamental if this was done, but I think that the Chinese government would do everything they could to prevent this, and that means let's make a deal. So when Trump puts something out there, so this is getting to the likelihood of it. It's not what would happen if, but I think it's not very likely, because this would be a devastating blow for China's understanding of the role of Hong Kong, at least in the near term. And Trump is only 4 years, am I right? So
We don't know.
We don't know.
I see, okay. The perpetual Trump. Okay, so
Let's not leave that hanging in the air. Then let's move on quickly to our next question here, please.
Thanks very much. My name is Dennis Kwok. I'm an elected lawmaker from Hong Kong. In 2012 to 2020, I served in the Legislative Council I'm now in exile in the United States. I have a $1 million bounty on my head put by the Hong Kong government, $1 million Hong Kong dollars, not US dollars. So in case you're wondering, don't try. Don't try. It's not worth it. Joking aside, this is very personal for especially those of us from Hong Kong who love the place. 5 years ago, if we're doing this seminar, it would be Freedom in Hong Kong. That would be the title. And now it's Authoritarianism in Hong Kong. It shows you how much the place has changed. There was some discussion, if I may, about whether Hong Kong is one country, two system is dead or whether it's damaged. It reminds me of a saying amongst Hong Kong people in Cantonese, 手術好成功，但個病人死咗. It means the operation is very successful, but the patient is dead. For us Hong Kong people, one country, two system is not some charts, some index. It is the way of life. It is knowing that you go to the newsstand, you can buy Apple Daily, you can buy all sorts of magazines about who's having a love affair amongst the Politburo Standing Committee, who's hiding assets in New York, or not caring at all about these things. Or going to school where your kids don't have to go through patriotic education. Or knowing that the courts can be trusted. Just last week, some of the ordinary Hong Kong citizens who happened to be at the Yunli station on the 21st of July, which Kellee mentioned, were sentenced to rioting for a couple of years in jail. All my colleagues are now in jail for pledging to use their elected position in the Legislative Council to vote against the budget if the Hong Kong government would not respond to the demands of the people. And what were those demands? Universal suffrage, as promised to the Hong Kong people under the Basic Law, our constitution. And they were using a right to do what? To veto the budget, which is a right that was given to them as legislators to vote down the budget. You say, I'll vote down for no reason. No, they had a very good reason to vote it down if the Hong Kong government does not respond. And some of my friends, like Professor Benny Tai, is spending 10 years in jail. And some of my colleagues, 7, 8 years. I don't know when I'll see them again. So this is very personal. This is not some abstract theory about, it is important to think on that level. But, my question is, there's an elephant in the room that we've so far not addressed. The PEC is important. I'll perhaps share with you offline what I think about the PEC. But it is Taiwan. Because remember, one country, two system was supposed to be the offer on the table for the unification of Taiwan, as originally designed by Deng Xiaoping. Now, after 2020, what happened in Hong Kong, the Taiwanese people have openly rejected the idea of one country, two system. My Taiwanese friends tell me that basically there's no constituency for one country, two system in Taiwan at all. Even the KMT, the most pan-blue politician in Taiwan, will not mention one country, two system. Not that the Taiwanese were very keen about the idea in the first place, but after they've seen what happened to Hong Kong, they're saying thanks, but no thanks. Hong Kong was very important in the sense that it was an international financial center. It was, a liberal city. But one thing, the geopolitical position of Hong Kong was very important in that it was the buffer zone for the stability of the region. Because when Taiwan people look at Hong Kong, we were free, we were prosperous. They were saying, okay, I'm not going to openly reject one country. We will be ambiguous about the whole thing, because we like Hong Kong. And then it seems to be going well, at least for the first 15 years after the handover. That provided an important stability for the region. But now that I always tell, when I was doing international engagement work as a lawmaker, I always tell my friends, you should care about Hong Kong because if Hong Kong were to fall, which I'm afraid it has fallen, the next problem you have on your desk is Taiwan. And unfortunately, that has become true because everything is coming to a head. The Taiwanese people say no to one country, two system. The Hong Kong people are leaving in about 800,000 people have left Hong Kong since 2020. So 1 in 10 people have left Hong Kong. And Xi Jinping is doubling down, saying one country, two system means the PRC and is the only offer on the table. My question to the panelists is, how do you see the Taiwan Strait situation, given what's happened to Hong Kong? Is there any remedy to pull it back so that at least we don't have to face any actual conflict over Taiwan, which no one wants to see. But it seems like things are heading that way. And are you concerned? Thank you very much.
Dennis. Yeah.
Well, I'm not the other lawyer in the room, so I'll go ahead. I'm very concerned. The book I mentioned, the first book talk was in Taiwan. And I was really concerned that there seemed to be almost living in dreamland, that nothing's going to happen or everything goes on as usual. And there was an election then, and they were debating economic issues, business stuff. And so I worry on the one hand that Taiwan is not prepared to defend itself if it's attacked. And then with Trump in the White House, I worry that the United States is not prepared to defend them either. So I think the situation is very precarious. I think that they have to study. I emphasized when I was there, they have to study what's happened in Hong Kong, the stuff we're talking about today. Because I asked the question when I was there, is Taiwan Afghanistan or is it Ukraine? And no one had an answer. In the case of Afghanistan, you recall that when the heat came on and the US was leaving, they just gave in and accepted whatever was going on. And Ukraine, of course, they're still resisting. But does Taiwan have the capacity to resist? I'm not sure of that. So I'm greatly worried about it. But it is understandable if they don't have the military capacity that they're going to sit down and try to negotiate the best deal they can. And I don't think they're going to get a good deal. They're going to have at best what Hong Kong has, and then the same result. That's my fear.
We all have friends and family in Taiwan, and after the last trip, I think I'm very nervous about going there. And again, I would put the odds at about half and half, about 50%. And essentially, I think China's strategy is kind of like just looking at Putin, with the term you can say peaceful reunification through strength. And a lot of Taiwanese, a lot of Hong Kongers in Taiwan think that if if Beijing sends out anything, essentially Taiwanese would just capitulate. There's a joke that they would just line up to surrender because there's no point. If you know that resistance is futile, then what's the point? What Hong Kong people did not do was knowing that resistance was futile, but still fought and hoped that the world would catch us. No one caught Hong Kong. No one would catch Taiwan.
So I don't see military conflict between China and Taiwan, or China and Japan, China and the US as likely in the near term. But I share your concern that there doesn't seem to be a strategy from the mainland beyond intimidation, military intimidation, which is we see this going on all the time. So how Taiwan handles this, I think this is what we're waiting to see. And of course, as you mentioned, Mr. Trump has what is it called? Strategic ambiguity? Mm-hmm. Well, this is that in spades.
Rana, did you want to come?
Yeah, just adding another element. It's worth looking at the very interesting voting patterns from the presidential election, which was held at the beginning of last year, the 2024 January Taiwan presidential election. Because what it showed also is the way in which quite fast-changing electoral politics could also influence the outcome on Taiwan. I think I agree with the rest of the panel. I think this is the shared position that military conflict may not be the most likely outcome. And while there's clearly plenty of planning for that in the United States, China, and elsewhere, from the point of view of China, a military attempt to recapture the island is not really, I say recapture on the grounds, I guess in 1949 under the Kuomintang was the last time it was part of a unified Chinese polity. But looking at the way in which Taiwan's quite distinctive political system operates is, I think, something that maybe outside observers could do more of. The two elements I'm thinking of, first of all, the fact that Lai Ching-te, the current president, won a plurality, but not a majority of the vote. And had it not been, and maybe those who know Taiwanese politics better than I do would say, I don't know how likely it was that the TPP and the KMT would have actually come up with a joint candidate. In the end, they very publicly, I think literally on television, were unable to agree on a candidate. You ended up with three. And in a three-way split, which again, unlike the French presidential system, doesn't have a second round, you basically need more votes than the next guy plus one. And that's what ended up happening. Whether that's guaranteed to happen next time, with the DPP asking for a fourth consecutive presidential term at a time when Taiwan's economy is not doing fantastically well, and there is a wider changing of the international system, I think is a difficult question to answer, because in a system where you have three candidates in a single member plurality, i.e. first past the post-electoral system, outcomes are really hard to predict if you don't have a very clear front runner. I'm not sure we are going to see a clear front runner. I mean, it's 3 years from now. The other element to add to it, of course, is the legislative yuan, where, as those who observe politics in Taiwan will know, the balance between blue and green forces is already much more even than, the presidency, either you win it or you don't, but the legislature obviously changes over time. And in that context, you can also see shifts at the moment that, if you wanted to look at it that way, could be different parties and different legislators hedging against a variety of outcomes, including one in which the United States is no longer a reliable backer of the continued autonomy of Taiwan, or one in which essentially trying to seek some sort of bargain, even from a weak position, may be a necessary outcome. So I'm not advocating any of this or saying that anything's definitely like to happen, but the examination of actually a quite complex internal democratic politics within Taiwan, I think, demands more urgent attention than perhaps it sometimes gets.
Yeah.
Kellee, you're from Taiwan.
Well, my parents are from Taiwan.
Yes.
I was born in Manhattan, Kansas.
The other Manhattan.
The other born in Manhattan, yeah.
The real man.
Dennis, I would completely agree that what happened in 2019, 2020 just completely eliminated one country, two systems as a plausible, credible model. It is completely off the table. It's just not credible at all. And I would agree with Victoria that there's a large portion of people in Taiwan, I think it's a generational thing, to maybe younger people, maybe people that are more our generation and older. They've got the fight in them, but they're kind of old, right? They're not serving in the military. And then the military service in Taiwan has been kind of a joke for decades now. Like, really, they wear sunscreen, and it's not. That's what, like, my classmates complain about. Like, they can't. They're not ready. They're not military ready. But what I've observed too is that there is, I wouldn't call it a fight, but there is an urge, or there's support among Hong Kongers in Taiwan, Hong Kongers abroad, and then some of the Taiwanese diaspora, where there's also very strong sentiments that Taiwan should not be taken over by mainland China. And the history of diasporic politics teaches us that sometimes they can be very influential. So I'll just leave it at that. Meanwhile, I'm worried about the foreign policy coming out of the current administration here, because it's really puzzling. Like, Trump says Xi Jinping is a really smart guy. He respects dictators and strongmen. But meanwhile, Trump aside, there is the securitization of everything in the US as well, not just in China. So if you look at it from a national security perspective, Taiwan is a democracy. It has TSMC. So if that portion of the dynamic continues, it's hard to see how the US would completely abandon Taiwan in the event of some incident that sparked conflict.
Yes, we have this gentleman here.
Hi, hello.
I think it's on. Yeah.
Oh, sorry. I'm
Right.
just hearing myself. I'm Justin. I'm a JD PhD student here at Harvard. And my question, I guess I have two questions. The first being about the politics of authoritarianism in Hong Kong, about the political realignment in the sense of, let's say, like James Scott writing about the weapons of the weak and the village people. I apologize for being more academic. I grew up in Hong Kong, but I guess I'm now in the US and I'm thinking about this from a very distant place and kind of rethinking about having grown up during this period of the protest. Let's put it there. So I guess my invocation of Scott and this thinking about the kind of the bottom up thinking is because after all, the Hong Kong social contract, much of its thinking about economic prosperity and civil liberties was forged during this kind of colonial Macklin Hose era where there was oppression, there was censorship, and there's a book in, I think recently by an HKU law professor about censorship and kind of, so during right now, let's concede it's authoritarianism. I wish, as I guess Dennis said, it was freedom in Hong Kong. But looking at the current news, looking at perhaps the Court of Final Appeal, looking at how they're taking LGBTQ rights, looking at how they're taking the procedural rights underneath the national security law. Recently, there was one case where it was overturned, although substantively it didn't matter. But also looking at like its governance of, let's say, fintech, of Uber, of like the kind of taxi unions. So at these places, where is the politics I'm curious about? And kind of, it's a similar thing with living in Trump's America. Like, where's the politics? Where's the resistance? How do you see it? My second question is a bit more about kind of the social science. So for Professor Tsai, I'm curious, the social science in Hong Kong, I wish it had more engagement back when I was growing up. I think all my classmates wanted to do law, wanted to do medicine. And especially with Hong Kong study and especially think about post-colonialism, I think today it's sometimes dismissed as being like a blind leftyism kind of thinking about post-colonialism because that's the same thing as for pro-China. But I think part of talk about Hong Kong is that there's a shock in seeing how many Hong Kong protesters back in 2020 supported Trump. They kind of supported the theory that Biden stole the election, that there was mail-in ballots that were forged. And I think it's also not surprising because you could see the xenophobia like against mainlanders, and even within mainlanders who, I have mainland colleagues in Hong Kong universities now who study China, and like they also feel marginalized in different ways. And I think that is very regrettable, and there's this kind of fetishization of the rule of law, thinking about like whatever the British gave us was the best. We have to keep it that way. The judges have to wear wigs and all of that kind of thinking. And I'm thinking like the relevance of that today for engaging with the West and engaging with the US, because John, you're talking about sanctions and don't sanction the judges. So then what is the kind of move to do for a place like Hong Kong? So I guess what's the agency to bring back Professor Tsai's kind of mentioning at the end?
Great, thank you.
Okay, I have some thoughts on the second. I mean, the Democratic Party, which was the party, you know, the opposition party and the party of accountability and participation and transparency and all these sorts of things, is now considering winding itself up. And so this is a very alarming development in my own view, but it is not a surprising development. So the way I look at it is that the pan-Democrats made mistakes along the way. In my view, they should have voted for universal suffrage with party vetting when it was offered to them in 2014. The pan-Democrats did a deal with the liaison office in 2010. And so there were opportunities. They would have been massive compromises, but would we be where we are now if these compromises had been made then? So the Democratic Party now, doesn't really have any place to go. I mean, they have been told they have to apologize, and Young Sum said, no, if we apologize, we won't be the Democratic Party anymore. We cannot lose our values, and I completely understand that. They are not in the legislature. They chose not to run in 2021. If they had been allowed to, if they had thrown their hat in, would they have been allowed to compete even? I'm doubtful. And then when it came to the district council elections in 2023, they tried and were shut out, essentially. And then I believe now they've been told for future LegCo elections, you have no hope. I mean, Dennis, you may know. Huh?
They're shutting down.
Yes,
Yeah.
this is exactly what's happening. So then where do this 40 to 60% of the people go? That's the question that you have asked. And so the Communist Party wants Democratic Party type organizations, I believe. And the Pan-Dems and the people like me who support them don't want that, I can tell you. And so this is, well, Lau Siu-kai said, we will run it this way until you realize that opposition is futile. That's what he said. And so have we gotten there yet? I don't think so. And so this is why Hong Kong, in my opinion, is still unstable. And in fact, the central government would agree with this, still unstable. So you mentioned, the colonial legacy as part of the first question. I'm not sure that I got all of it, but from my perspective, Hong Kong did not decolonize in 1997. It went right through to 2020 with its colonial political institutions intact, its colonial economic, religious, education institutions intact. And only after the blow up in 2019 did the central government put decolonization on the table. If you look at the basic law for education, it says something like, well, Hong Kong may keep its current education system and start to develop it from there. But Hong Kong never did. I mean, Hong Kong, apart from some modest reforms. So where's the post-colonialism? We're living it now, I would say.
Sorry, go ahead.
Just very briefly, I agree completely. Hong Kong never had a post-colonial moment.
Yeah.
And you could really feel it among the people. Like there's a real sense of angst. Like we never had a chance to have a say or input about how we are governing ourselves or how we are being governed. But not only, in addition to what you said, you also can't call it a post-colonial territory because textbooks no longer refer to Hong Kong as a colony.
Yes.
It was a place that was occupied for a very long time.
That absurdity.
The word, you can't call it a colony anymore in the textbooks.
Yeah, just going along with that is that essentially, I would say Hong Kong was recolonized by Beijing in 1997. And you think about it is that Hong Kong used to have all these local indigenous businesses, and even the construction company, the biggest one in Hong Kong, had to close down because all the contracts go to China Construction. And then Hong Kong actually doesn't really need all of those Northern Territory projects, but because all the mainland companies are going to really profit from these contracts. And so essentially it is exploitation, material exploitation, not just political repression. I want to use James Scott's another book to answer your question about James Scott's Weapons of the Weak. Read also James Scott's Seeing Like the State. A state that has immense capacity to see everything look at the number of surveillance cameras. There's nothing that's not seen by people sitting in control command rooms. there's very little room for the weak to exercise any kind of weapons. There's nowhere to hide. Think about in 1989, a lot of Chinese dissidents left China through Hong Kong. Consider the possibility of that happening today impossible. And I also feel very sad. This is one issue that I've been looking at, is that a lot of people, not just Hong Kongers, but Taiwanese and even Tibetans, they supported Trump last time. There is this, basically, they don't understand US-China relations through history. They didn't take my US-China relations course. They thought that Trump is the first one to stand up strong against China. Forget that Trump also said in August 2019 that, Xi Jinping knows how to deal with these rioters in Hong Kong. Xi Jinping is my buddy, all of those things. They also don't know that Obama started the pivot. They also don't understand that the original thing is Nixon. And so a lot of those things have happened. But then Hong Kongers, and it's not just that, all of these people, they in the US, they think that the Democrats sell out to China. In the UK, they think that the Labour Party sells out to China. And so they are all single issue voters, and this is why it is problematic. And I hope that you really open their eyes, but then these days when these societies are so polarized, even in Taiwan, Taiwanese are so polarized. I was stunned because a lot of people who study international relations, even a lot of these very senior professors, I was stunned by how they talk about US politics. It's like, we're just pawns in US-China relations. We have nothing to do. We can't do anything about it. Whatever the US imposes on us. It's that kind of thinking among a lot of KMT supporters. And so essentially, how do the weak exercise their weapons? They have to come together. They have to know that even if resistance is futile, they have to kind of really hold on to Hong Kong people's once believe that. It's not that because there's hope that we continue to fight. It's because we continue to fight, so there's still hope. So if my worry is that a lot of people don't fight or they don't know what they're doing.
I think it's wrong, though, to say that Hong Kong was recolonized. I mean, this is a very, very strong statement. And the relationship between the central government and the local government isn't a colonial relationship after 1997, in my view. We also have to recognize that Hong Kong is divided itself, and that there is very substantial support, although maybe minority support, for rule by the central government. So no, I would reject that it was this notion that it was the relationship is a colonial one, which is racist and dominant, complete domination, and everything is for the metropolitan, the capital. It wasn't. It isn't like that.
Mm-hmm.
I can add just one sentence.
Please. Yep.
Yeah, I think that not having a post-colonial period is baked in to the Sino-British Joint Declaration and the Basic Law. Hey, 50 years, no change. And Beijing, basically, if it had a desire, regardless of what it put in its documents, by the way, a footnote on your free speech point, there's 16 rights in the Basic Law. 8 of them relate to free speech in one form or another. So it's really hard to not take that seriously. That's a very fundamental characteristic. In any event, I think it's baked in, so you don't have a post-colonial period because Beijing doesn't want a post-colonial period. So maybe it is a colony.
Might be just worth observing that, of course, Taiwan doesn't have a post-colonial period either, because it moved straight out of Japanese colonial occupation into an extremely disturbing period of Kuomintang rule, which contains, amongst other things, the famous 228 incident. And then by the time you get a reckoning when the state has opened up in a big way and democratizes in the 80s and 90s, it's really a backlash against unification with by the Kuomintang that comes into the public sphere. The Japanese are much more of an undercurrent in that sense. You remember when Lee Donghui was elected as president, he caused a certain amount of outrage, but more outrage, I think, in the mainland than in Taiwan, by saying that he considered Japanese to be his first language, and he meant it in a positive sort of way. I also note Taiwanese friends who observe that many Taiwanese Chinese fought in World War II, but they fought on the Japanese side, of course. And this is something, again, that doesn't always get mentioned. It cuts across one of the areas that, a separate area that I've dealt with. I don't want to distract at this late point, to do with the World War II legacy and the 1949 legacy. But the point is that in some ways, the difference in Taiwan today, and one of the reasons why transferring the politics of Hong Kong to Taiwan has been difficult and will be difficult, is that a great many people in Taiwan really have shaped a new discourse in which either Taiwan really has no connection with the mainland at all, it's a sort of narrative of an entirely autonomous state, or else it's one in which there was a connection, but it's something of the past, it's purely historical, it doesn't really have a link with the present day. And whatever the historical narrative that Hong Kong has had, even at its most liberal in the 1990s and early 2000s, it has never, I think, tried to claim that it was not part of that wider Chinese polity, whereas there's a significant part of Taiwan's public sphere that claims today exactly that, and doesn't necessarily find the conversations of Hong Kongers who are there entirely compatible with that particular discourse.
Thank you, Rana. John, do you have any last comments before we wind things down here? I'd love to give you the last word.
Well, yeah, okay. So we're talking about authoritarianism in Hong Kong. And I think we shouldn't confuse that with colonialism, for example. They are very different. And when we're looking at the future of Hong Kong, then we haven't really talked, mostly it's been backward looking. Yeah. And so what is the future? And is there a future of hope for Hong Kong? So the Hong Kong government tells people like me to tell good stories about Hong Kong when I go overseas. Well, if you're listening, I don't do that. And I have to say that the situation now looks bleak. Hong Kong's economy is increasingly integrated with the mainland. Mainland economy is decoupling from China or from the US to a certain extent at the West, and this is also very bad. So I don't have a positive, picture to paint going forward. One possibility, though, is for the pan-democrats, people like me, to gain the trust of the central government. I think this is very important. Gain the trust of the central government, but push for accountable government, for participative government, and for transparent government. The pressure for this has to be continuous, and it is in the media. The media gets stopped, but it is in the media. It is in the universities, in spite of what Kellee had to say. These kind of things are still going on, and we as citizens of goodwill need to encourage them. Thank you.
Great, thank you, John. So, as I said, there'll be a reception in the room to the left, and I'd also like to thank you all for coming, and thank you to the Harvard-Yenching Institute staff, Lindsay, Susan, Francesca, Rohong, James back here, for all of you did for this, and most importantly, thank you to John for agreeing to come and speak before the keynote address at the Association for Asian Studies, and then to all the panelists for responding and also coming with your own ideas today to discuss this important topic. And I was so glad, John, I had thought of having you all look into the looking glass to try to point to the future, but it felt tricky to do that. But you did it, and I'm glad you did, even if it presents a not less than rosy picture. But thank you very much for all of you, and thank you for the questions. And please carry on the conversation in the reception that's next door. So thank you again for coming.